I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we talk about the slashing of US aid and how Trump wants to access Ukraine's rare minerals in exchange for military support. Meanwhile, on the front lines, Russia has had more losses over the last 2 months than at any other point since the beginning of the full-scale invasion.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 4th of February, 2 years and 340 days since the full-scale invasion began. I'm joined by Dom Nicholls, Associate Editor for Defence, and Francis Dearnley, Executive Audio Editor.
Well, hi Adélie. Hello everybody. Let's start inside Ukraine. A Russian missile strike this morning on the town of Izium, that's about 100 km southeast of Kyiv, killed at least 5 people, injured at least 24. That's according to Governor Oleh Symonov. Residential buildings and a civil administration building were hit by what's been assessed as a cruise missile. That was part of a wider overnight attack that saw 65 drones fired by Russia across 5 Ukrainian oblasts. 37 were shot down, 28 others were either brought down by electronic warfare or decoys and harmlessly piled in. Attacks elsewhere across Kyiv city and Kharkiv, Kherson and Sumy oblasts killed another couple and another 2 and injured many more. Now then, January this year was the second highest month of losses for Russia since the start of the full-scale invasion. These stats come from Ukraine's MOD speaking yesterday. They say Russia lost 48,240 casualties last month. Casualties being, we count killed, wounded, prisoner and missing. I've only ever really seen killed and wounded in reference in Ukrainian statistics, but they must also account for missing and taken prisoner, so I think it is broadly the same. Now then, Institute for the Study of War analysts say that for that price of 48,240 casualties, Putin's forces gained roughly 498 square kilometres in Ukraine and Kursk Oblast, which works out to be roughly 16.1 square kilometres a day. Another way of looking at that is that it cost 97 casualties per square kilometre gained in January. That's a company's worth of men. A whole company lost for every square kilometre. Now, aside from that disgusting human toll, just think about what that is doing to the wider Russian logistics system of battlefield retrieval of dead bodies, although we haven't seen a huge amount of that. But the medical chain, right down to everything, the supply of boots. Just think what's happening to the Russian logistic chain and the burden it's putting upon them. Now, for reference, at 48,670, so just a few hundred more than January, 48,670, December 2024 was Russia's highest monthly casualty rate. So December and January just gone the highest casualty rates since the start of the full-scale invasion. Now, that is not happening because of any, increased lethality making mechanized warfare more dangerous. It's happening because Russia is reliant upon the human wave tactics. They're desperate to get any ground ahead of any sort of Trump-imposed ceasefire or what have you. I mean, this is not, contrary to what they would want us to believe, this is not the second best army in the world. And actually right now, I would say it's showing itself to be the second best army in Russia. Now then, last one for me, Adélie. I'm sorry, my voice is going again. It's the One-Eater's peanuts. I've been on them again. I really shouldn't eat all these peanuts before coming on here. Sorry. Colonel Vadim Shukarevsky, the commander of the Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces, gave an interview to Radio Liberty. It was published yesterday. He said Ukrainian forces had hit a Buk M3 to be precise, that's an air defence system, but hit it 57 kilometres from the front line in the middle of last month. That is quite some distance. He also said FPV drones, so the first-person view drones, hunting Russian reconnaissance drones has led to a tenfold decrease in Russian reconnaissance drone usage. I've seen social media just in the last couple of days of a purporting to be a Ukrainian mothership drone from which are launched smaller FPV to ram into Russian reconnaissance drones. It is an evolution of aerial drone warfare. Now, Colonel Sikorevsky also highlighted Ukraine's production of FPV and other drones made entirely of Ukrainian-made components, shoring up the supply chain, and said that Ukraine is working to develop a way to counter Russian forces' use of fibre optic cable drones. So fibre optic cable that spools out the back of a drone. That means that it's not subject to electronic warfare. Yes, the cable can get snagged on trees and all the rest of it, but it is, for the moment, it's an innovation that means that the drones are very, very hard to intercept. And I think the last time I crunched the numbers, it's for each kilogram of cabling will give a drone about a 4K range. That's the weight of the stuff, so that's not bad. Only a kilogram, which even the very small FPV drones is capable of lifting, to give you a 4-kilometre range of largely, pretty much unhackable for the moment capability. That's pretty good. Colonel Sikorevsky said that Ukraine is working hard to produce its own fibre optic cable drones, or capable drones. That reporting was from the ISW, Institute for the Study of War. I'll offer some thoughts on that a little bit later for final thoughts, but that, Adélie, is us up to date.
Thanks, Dom. And now I turn to you, Francis. What are the diplomatic and political updates? There are loads today.
Thanks, Adélie. Yes, the global shockwaves as the US seemingly looks to adopt a more protectionist, transactional economic stance have ramifications far beyond finance. It's impacting global geopolitics at conference tables and dinner tables in some of the world's poorest countries. Rarely can a policy adjustment's implications be seen so quickly. I'll focus on both impacts today, though I'll start by asking again whether this policy is built on something of a false premise. For is the US, as a superpower, really being ripped off in a world where trade between allies is flowing relatively peacefully? It was Rome, after all, that benefited more from Pax Romana. And if America's aid programs erode the influence of its rivals in countries like Africa and neuter political violence, is that not also a net gain for the US in the end? No one is doubting this is costly, but the idea that it's mere expensive altruism is surely incorrect. But anyway, transactional Trump underscored yesterday that he wants a deal granting the US access to Ukraine's rare earths resources in exchange for continued military and economic aid to Kyiv. We're putting in hundreds of billions of dollars, he said. They have great rare earth, and I want security of the rare earth, and they're willing to do it. On the surface, many will see this, of course, as crass, and yet there is opportunity here, as will be obvious. The deeper invested that the US becomes in Ukraine's future and prosperity, the less likely it is to abandon her. Indeed, as the Financial Times writes, the proposal appears to align with a strategy Ukraine has been developing to deepen ties with the Trump administration by allowing the US access to critical minerals used in high-tech industries. A person close to Zelensky told the Financial Times that Trump's remarks seemed to align with the victory plan presented to him in the fall, saying Kyiv had offered Trump special terms for cooperation on key resources, stressing the need to protect them from Russia and Iran. Just for context, as we've discussed many times on the podcast before, Kyiv holds vast reserves of titanium, iron ore, coal, as well as 500,000 tonnes of untapped lithium, collectively estimated to be worth tens of trillions of dollars. This matters. I remember citing a piece a year or so ago, I think, in the New York Review of Books, which argued that one could read this conflict as an imperialist war conducted in part to acquire resources which will become ever more vital in the future. Not everyone is happy at this turn of events, though. Ever politically astute Olaf Scholz has called Trump's desire very selfish and self-centred, stressing that Ukraine's resources should be used for reconstruction after the war. Frankly, I imagine the fact that the Chancellor of Germany is unhappy will hardly act as a reason for Trump not to pursue this, probably the reverse, but there we are. Trump's wider policy of trade wars, tariffs and sanctions will no doubt concern Moscow, though for now, as the BBC's Steve Rosenberg writes, Russian newspapers report benefits of this new policy. One claims, and I quote, "There are pluses for Russia from Trump's actions. This will become an additional window of opportunity to expand our export market." Now, just an aside from me, China, of course, will no doubt be thinking the same, wanting to appear stable and thus a more attractive trade partner for many countries. But on the US freezing of US aid in particular, which Elon Musk allegedly now wants to see ceased entirely as a department, the Russian press sounds frankly cock-a-hoop, no doubt because it was the biggest threat to them trying to buy power and influence in other parts of the world. Tellingly too, the 80th anniversary of the Yalta Conference, the World War II meeting of the heads of the US, the UK and the Soviet Union to discuss the post-war reorganisation of Germany and Europe, has also been widely reported in Russia today. One paper even says that there needs to be a Yalta 2.0, with Putin, Xi and Trump carving up the new world order for the coming decades. This is what, of course, Putin craves: recognition of Russia as a great power at the top table of global affairs, slicing the world into spheres of influence. On that point, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov has written a very revealing long read for Global Affairs magazine, which underscores Moscow's objectives. He argues that the UN was the key mechanism for decolonisation, forming centres of power in the multipolar world, which he goes on by implication to say Moscow wants to cheerlead for. He then says, in a manner so dumbfoundingly hypocritical it makes you wince at the page, as Russian scholars rightly note, any international institution is above all a way to limit the natural egoism of states. The UN order is thus based on international law, from which it follows that every state should abide. Russia, like the majority of the world community, has never had any difficulty in doing so. But the West was never cured of its syndrome of exceptionalism and retains its neo-colonial habits, i.e. living at the expense of others. Interstate relations based on respect for international law were, from the very beginning, not to the West's liking. He then goes on. In 2025, with Trump's Republican administration back in power, Washington's interpretation of international processes since the Second World War have taken on a new dimension. Not only the Yalta-Potsdam order is undesirable, so too is the rules-based order that had seemed to embody the selfishness and arrogance of the US-led West after the Cold War. America First is alarmingly similar to the Hitlerite slogan, Germany above all, and a wager on peace through strength may be the final blow to diplomacy. Not to mention that such statements and ideological constructs do not show even the slightest bit of respect for Washington's international legal obligations under the UN Charter. Multipolarity is gaining momentum, and instead of opposing it, the US could, in the foreseeable future, become a responsible centre of power along with Russia, China, and other states in the global south. Brazen attempts to reorder the world in one's own interest, violating UN principles, may bring instability, confrontation, and even catastrophe. Quite so, but, it's been Russia that, of course, have been doing that most starkly over the past 3 years. But those words by Sergey Lavrov speak to Russia's desire to speak up for the former colonies as a guarantor of fair international law as laid out by the UN Charter. This is despite conducting itself in brazenly imperialist, extractionalist ways for decades, and when in the peace, he even refers to it fighting to suppress the Western-supported forces of the racist regime in Kyiv. Already, Moscow is moving into the sphere being left by the US, withdrawing from its support for emerging nations. And just on that, let me end with the impact of the newer US economic policy on all manner of organisations, including humanitarian, around the world. I want to thank everybody who works for these organisations who've spoken to us on and off the record in the past week or so. I'll quote from a couple of those organisations now, though I won't name them at their request. One international NGO working in Ukraine told us, "Chaos has been caused by the unanticipated instruction to suspend all payments for 90 days without warning and with immediate effect, without clarity on how this should be done or what the rules are. It affects current funding, not just future funds, so it's had an immediate impact on our activities. In Ukraine, some significant projects are affected, with no obvious alternative means to providing this much needed support. Globally, it represents over 20% of our income, so it is a major hit. It means we're having to lay off staff in our affected programs and massively cut costs elsewhere. We are aware of other NGOs that are significantly more impacted. And one of those organisations is another that I'll quote from now. As an organisation that is 95% funded by the US government, we must engage in deep spending cuts to survive now, deliver on ongoing commitments, and preserve our ability to recover as an organisation. As a result, more than 500 colleagues will be furloughed, replaced on unpaid leave, terminated, or have their hours drastically reduced. Now, I'm barely scratching the surface here, but the impact is being felt across the world, impacting frontline support services right now in Ukraine and many other countries. An elderly lady no longer receiving a hot meal in the Donbass might seem insignificant in the grand scheme of global politics. But if the West is willing to abandon these people to their fate, then many will wonder whether that might one day come back to haunt us.
Thank you, Francis, for these somber updates. While we were giving you updates on Ukraine, there was some breaking news that the first UK-EU Leaders Summit will be held in London on May 19th. So that's something to look out for in terms of cooperation between the UK and the EU, especially when it comes to support to Ukraine. And now we're featuring an interview with Asami Terajima, one of the Kyiv Independent's Frontline reporters. We sat down with her during our trip to Kyiv at the end of November to discuss her reporting on chemical warfare from Russia and how it's being handled by Ukraine.
Asami, it's a pleasure to be talking to you here at the Kyiv Independent offices. This was an interview that David was meant to do, and we were very keen to make sure that we were able to do it following his passing. So it's, as I say, a real pleasure to be able to talk to you today. Can we start with the subject of chemical warfare? I know this is something that you've been particularly focused on in recent months. Where do you want to start on this perhaps underappreciated aspect of the war?
First, I just wanted to say thanks for having me, and I'm very sorry for your loss. David was such a remarkable journalist, and he's inspired every one of us who's been following his work. I think that it's such a big loss in the international journalism community to have such a young and talent gone, but we always remember him, and thank you so much for keeping up your work. Yes, chemical warfare is something that is often not talked about. First, it's because it's very difficult to understand the scope of it, because Ukrainian military has long not revealed what its findings are, because they were afraid of making wrong interpretations, translating information in the wrong way, but also they were just taboo. Like the military press officers have often told me not to even ask soldiers about chemical weapons, which I think is also because the soldiers often have a very low understanding of what they are, so they may misquote something, or they may, interpret things in a wrong way. So the biggest issue with Russia's rising use of chemical agents against Ukrainian soldiers is that many are not prepared for such new tactic, because as Russia intensifies its chemical warfare tactics by deploying drones that throw grenades that contain chemical agents into trenches to force out the Ukrainian soldiers so that they are out in the open and become very easy targets. The biggest issue that I've been hearing from dozens of soldiers interviewed over summer across the front is that many are not prepared. Many don't understand the threat of these gas attacks, because they assume that it's some kind of a gas that you kind of you struggle to breathe for a few minutes, but then you're okay, and it's much less scarier than, say, like artillery drones or glide bombs. But the truth is that Russia mixes these conventional arms together with gas so that they can sow panic among Ukrainian soldiers, especially those that are unprepared, like the ones that I've interviewed on the very front line. They are able to force them out, and what many Ukrainian soldiers say is that the biggest worry is their comrades getting into panic and running into, because when you're in panic, it's impossible to hear anyone, and it's really impossible to think logically, and that is putting your own life at higher risk, but also putting your comrades' lives at such a significant risk as well. So yes, it's against chemical weapons conventions to use such chemical agents, even if it's tear gas, and tear gas being used on the front line is considered chemical warfare as per OPCW, which is the UN watchdog for chemical weapons. But Russia continues to use them, and the thing that what we need to pay attention on the most is how the negligence is still spread among Ukrainian soldiers and the Ukrainian military on the threat of these gas attacks.
So do you think that's why the Ukrainian government don't like you asking questions on this is because it exposes vulnerabilities in Ukrainian preparedness for these kind of attacks and is bad for morale.
I think those two factors may have played a role in the beginning of the year, but towards summer they've been more open and they've been willing to answer more journalists' questions. So it seems that they've kind of begun to realize that as Russia intensifies the chemical weapon usage, they also understand that they can't kind of be silent about this, because literally many soldiers are saying and writing on social media or saying in interviews that they've suffered gas attacks. So I think the military and the government have been kind of forced to answer those questions. I've spoken to a colonel from the support forces of the Ukrainian military, which is in charge of inspecting chemical warfare. He said that the biggest concern is that Ukraine is increasingly recording unidentified chemical agents. So he said that these substances seem to be newer or mixed forms of gas, and he said it's similar to CS, which is a common type of tear gas that yesterday OPCW, the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague, confirmed to being used on the battlefield, but even though it didn't say who is using it, but yesterday they confirmed this. He said that the new gas that Russia is deploying, is very similar to CS, but it's not exactly the same. And when Ukraine is unable to understand what exactly Russia is using, because it doesn't have hundreds of detectors that cost, according to him, from $100,000 to $600,000. Ukraine is also unable to understand how to protect its troops in the best way, and also Ukraine doesn't have enough gas masks, the Western ones that really provide the protection. So many of the interviews that they were only given the Soviet-era masks that are basically very big. It's very hard to carry and it's not very effective, and many soldiers don't even bother taking it to the position because they don't think it's effective. And basically what soldiers have to do then is to buy their own, but they just don't want to, because they'd rather send the money to their families or save it for other things like repairing cars. So that's why there have been many cases where there are 20 or 30 soldiers at a certain position and there were only 2 gas masks available, and that also is something that Ukraine needs to address.
And that's something that Hamish de Bretton Gordon on our own podcast has spoken about a lot, that absence of good and effective gas masks. I wonder, Asami, when we're talking about the impact of gas, you made an allusion there that there have been injured soldiers. This is something that is very familiar as a technique of war, particularly I think to many British listeners, because of the portraits, the photography of the consequences of gas attacks in the First World War, famous depictions of people having to wear handkerchiefs over their eyes because of the damage that had been caused, records of people unable to speak, poetry by Wilfred Owen describing the froth-corrupted lungs. It's visceral and horrific. But we haven't really seen those visual consequences in this conflict. And I wonder, why is that? Why are we not seeing those consequences?
I think first is because the gas that Russia has deployed so far is not as lethal. According to the Ukrainian military, Russia has deployed CS and CN tear gases in addition to ammonia and chlorpyrifene. While they can have a more lethal impact if they're deployed in places like small dugouts where there are many soldiers hiding inside and it's very small, concentrated with people, then that can have an impact. But usually the wind is able to blow away chemicals and it's not as dangerous after about 30 minutes. The effect usually goes off. But many soldiers have adjusted to, there are times when there is no gas mask present, or sometimes Russian, for example, drones just kind of destroy the gas mask, so you can't use it anymore. In such cases, the soldiers have thought of creative ways to protect themselves, using wet tissues and replacing them every 5 minutes so that it's still filtering out the chemicals, even though it's not really doing the best job. I've heard also some of them pee on their clothes and then they put it on their face, and apparently that helps them not breathe as much chemicals.
And those were tactics used in the First World War as well. So it's a repeat of that, but perhaps it's just not being as recorded. It's certainly not as much in the public consciousness as it perhaps deserves to be.
I've heard from some soldiers that at the hospitals when they were admitted and they clearly suffered from gas attacks, the doctors were reluctant to write that these people suffered from chemical agent. Instead, they wrote like concussion or like other diagnoses, which they questioned like why, we even have like the cannon, we have the photo of the grenade, the remains of the grenade, and obviously the Russians use gas, but there's been a reluctance from what I hear from soldiers on the hospital side as well to on military hospitals especially.
So why do you think that is? From the medical side?
I think that Ukraine is just very nervous to kind of make assumptions about chemical warfare when I think it was not ready to record such number of cases, and often it's very difficult to prove that someone has suffered from chemical attacks, especially after a certain time, and it's always from the front line. It's not that if someone's injured or someone suffered from gas attacks, oftentimes we cannot take them out immediately. It takes hours or days for them to actually be evacuated from the position, and because of the lack of medical evacuation, also it's very difficult to collect the evidence because it's very difficult for the inspection teams to actually get to the position that is about 7, 8, 9 kilometers away, and you have to go on foot because armored carriers, Ukraine first of all doesn't have enough armored carriers, and even pickup trucks, they're very good targets for Russian drones, so it's just very difficult to get anywhere close to the position, and risking the inspection teams to just go on a 7-8 kilometer mission under heavy fire of Russian drones and artillery, that's almost a suicide mission. And if you don't have enough specialists that are trained by OPCW standards, you can't just send them away. So I think Ukraine is very concerned about making assumptions because it's a very new field and it's struggling to understand what Russia is basically using. And according to the colonel I spoke with in the military, he said that Russia continues to produce them, and he claimed that Ukraine has identified about 10 sites that that have either produced such grenades before or are doing so now.
It's curious, isn't it? Because there would be some advantages, perhaps politically at least, for Ukraine to be talking about this much more. But perhaps, as we were talking about earlier on, there are concerns that if this is articulated, it could have an impact on morale on the front. It could have an impact on the way in which soldiers engage. It's an uncomfortable truth, and perhaps that may be a reason why it's being concealed.
It's definitely an uncomfortable truth, but I think that for many of the guys that are being kind of forced to consider joining the army, I think there are other issues that are much bigger at stake, like command issues that probably they are more disheartened by. But I just wanted to add that, according to the source in the defense ministry that I spoke with, he said that Ukraine has been so far reluctant also because if Russia decides to use a much scarier and much deadlier chemical weapons, then if Ukraine is already making assumptions about, wrong assumptions, then the Western partners will not take Ukraine to account because
I see.
It's
so
what I was told.
I understand. So it's basically that if Ukraine misunderstands what's happening, that gives Russia valuable intelligence that will shape what weapons they use in the next phase and that sort of thing.
And it also decreases West's trust on Ukraine.
Interesting. Well, you mentioned there the other concerns that soldiers have for fighting, and I know this is also an area that you do a lot of work in, and indeed an ongoing investigation that you're tasked with. So what are the main deficiencies as far as you can see at the moment in terms of manpower and in terms of why people perhaps aren't joining in the same way they were 2 years ago, or almost 3 years ago now?
It's the Ukrainian military's inability to be open about its issues and actually take proactive steps to solving them. And that starts from the Soviet-era command system remaining in the military and top leadership being very reluctant to actually address the reality of the situation on the battlefield, and leadership's tendency to micromanage what's going on the front line, even though one man, for example, cannot be in charge of everything. and instead it would be more effective to decentralize the armies. There are already command groups that are in charge of like certain directions, for example, Liman direction or like Bakhmut direction or Donetsk direction. There are those commands in place. It's just that they lack the power to do really anything because the top leadership is trying to control everything. And for example, like Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky, he would go to some, let's say, like Pokrovsk area for like a couple of days or a day, and he thinks that he can just solve issues very quickly, whereas it has to be a person who's managing it every single day from morning to evening and understanding what's happening, because no one person can just go and fix everything, and no one person can just manage everything from what's happening in, let's say, Kursk Oblast in Russia to, like, let's say, the Pokrovsk sector. And I think it also comes down to the Ukrainian military leadership being able to trust the local commands more so that they can, for example, make bigger decisions and take quicker actions rather than running everything by the top generals, which often takes more time, and they often don't know exactly what's really going on because it's something that is very far away from them, and you have to really be focused on one specific direction to understand and to make the decisions at the right timing.
We do a lot of reporting on the state of morale in the Russian armed forces, particularly because of this idea of them being sent mindlessly into the so-called meat grinder. I wonder if you can compare that attitude towards how Ukrainian soldiers feel about being sent into certain fronts. We've heard reports, of course, of perhaps not quite to the same degree, but concerns about inadequate training and that having an impact on morale. I mean, what's your sense from talking to soldiers? And I know that that's a very big question because there are so many different fronts and it's such an extended front, but just a general picture of how you think soldiers are reacting at the moment.
Yeah, unfortunately it's a war, and Ukraine is also going through the same boat. It also depends on the unit, because for example, like more elite units such as Azov, Third Assault, or let's say Khartia, which is also a National Guard unit, they're doing very good training of the troops, and they have a very good command structure where it's more similar to NATO standards, and every soldier is kind of informed with what their tasks are and what they're supposed to do when they go to the position and until when they need to stand there. It's not like the Soviet system where the soldiers kind of don't know anything, they're just sent there without being really informed of what they're going to see or if there is going to be even a position to stand, which is a very common case. And they know exactly why, like they are standing there, the guys from these units that I mentioned, and what could happen if things go wrong. Like there's a whole evacuation plan, and they know that their units will come out to help them and get them if they are wounded. Whereas most other units, especially the mechanized ones, they don't have such luxury. And many of them, when they go through these basic training courses, they get very little out of it, because for most of the guys it's only a month, and a month is really nothing, but also like a month is especially nothing if the training is ineffective. Soldiers that I spoke to, they said they had to walk kilometers every single day to get to the training ground from their base. That is already exhausting them. Then when they actually get to the training ground, they said that they shot very little, so to the point that they've only shot maybe a couple of hours maximum, but standing in a very big queue, almost 100 other guys. So when they go to the position, when they're sent to the position, they really don't know how to shoot or even defend themselves or like to survive. And some of them have said that they are very worried about their lack of knowledge of first tactical medicine, because they're really worried that if they're in a situation where they have to save their comrades and they cannot save them because they don't know how to like put on a tourniquet properly or evacuate the wounded properly under Russian drones, then that's their biggest concern, because more than themselves, they're more worried about other guys dying because of their inability to save them.
And is this training being provided by NATO countries, or is this training that is by third-party entities, by the government? I mean, what do you think is the biggest issue here?
It's conducted by the Ukrainian military, the general staff, and they're the ones writing the curriculums. I think that there's already been 4 different types of curriculums, and on the paper it looks very good, but to make it, to actually implement that system is very difficult first, because there's a lot of guys, there's more guys than the program requires, so it's just difficult for the guys to take turns, and they have to wait a lot, they have to do a lot of like imitations, because there's not enough, for example, time, but also there's not enough resources oftentimes, so the bullets or ammunition that they want to use to the training. There's also the lack of instructors who can properly answer questions. I was told that in some training centers they just kind of read these textbooks just for the sake of reading, but not really to actually get any point across. There are many questions regarding the flexibility that these troops have in such places, because when you come from a city that you kind of got to do everything, and all of a sudden you're sent to a training ground where you're literally just stuck on a base, and like you live in a tent all of a sudden, and you go to the bathroom that's outdoors. It's just a very different living condition, and you don't really have the freedom to go out anywhere, to go shopping much, and the contrast in which you have to kind of get used to is also something difficult for the guys. And many of the guys coming, according to the heads of some of the training centers I spoke to, they said that they often lack the motivation, because right now in this stage of the war no one really wants to fight. People understand that at some point they have to fight, and some of them are looking for the units that they want to join, but most of them are just trying to find ways to avoid fighting, because
to survive,
and many of them just know the reality of the battlefield and how the losses, yes, it's less than the Russian losses, but it's still very high. It's just not talked about, because the Ukrainian military, I think more than all, is very afraid that many guys would run away or would be very scared to join the military if they really know the cost of the war and the cost of defending each town and cities.
So one final question then on this theme. Do you think, from the soldiers that you've spoken to, that the Ukrainian armed forces are ready for negotiations?
So I've been asking this question over the past year, since January, because I've heard many guys saying if I knew that I would have to fight for longer than a year, then I would have never joined the army. And they're also saying how exhausted they are and how they just want to go home. It doesn't really matter, if the Frontline freezes, they just want to go home, because they see how life in places like Kyiv is continuing, and they're just in a trench, and they don't even know if they're ever going to see their family. And I would always ask him, so how do you think the war will end? And I would say the majority of the people that I spoke to over the past year in depth have told me that there has to be negotiations, and there's no way. I mean, some of them even said that the best case scenario is a frozen front line. Yeah. Worst is if Russia continues to advance forward, because Russia still has enormous resources to do so. And the majority have also said that they're just ready for the front line to freeze so they can go home, and they understand that Russia can re-invade again, but they're just so done of seeing their guys die every single day. And they're just really morally tired and exhausted. They understand that they lost so many guys already to defend the country, but they also understand the cost that it would take Ukraine to, for example, liberate even cities like Bakhmut that Russia captured in May 2023. So the majority of the people I spoke to have already, they understand that liberating territories that were lost to Russia is almost impossible, and they understand that the most important thing is to save as many guys as possible, because every single day there are hundreds being killed and wounded, and they're just sick of seeing this reality and with no end in sight.
Well, thank you, Asami, very much for your time on these really important subjects. Is there anything else that may not be on our minds that are on yours?
I would say that even if the Ukrainian military doesn't really talk about, the struggles, I would say that really the front line is getting worse every single day. Russian forces are continuing to advance, and really the situation is deteriorating. So it would be really nice if people kind of don't forget about Ukraine.
Of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Shall we move on to our final thoughts then? Dom, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Adélie. So I spoke earlier about Colonel Vadim Sukharevsky, who's the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces. He was discussing on Radio Liberty about developments and innovation in the drone world, and offered some comments there. Now, I was told this week that a separate but I guess related subject, that the half-life of Gen AI, so generative AI, the sort of, next iteration, if you like, of the development of AI, the half-life of Gen AI is 3 months. A fairly sort of wet finger in the air figure, debated, I'm sure, by technical people who know much more about it than I do, but they're talking a very small number of months rather than years, that kind of thing. And the point they're making is that the speed of innovation and development in Gen AI and AI more broadly is just absolutely staggering. Now, I've been wondering, it got me thinking about what the half-life of drone innovation and development might be and what that effect would have on the wider military system. So, I'd be interested in your thoughts here, folks. If we were to throw our vision forward 18 months, for example, pick a number, but let's go for 18 months. What could we realistically expect to be the state of the art in drone warfare in terms of drone development and the wider systems and all that kind of stuff? The onboard processing power, what it can do, what it can queue, who it can talk to, all that kind of stuff. What do we think? What do we realistically think drones might be capable of in, let's say, 18 months' time? And therefore, what other actions should be started now by various militaries, as Ukraine's, etc., to address all the other defence lines of development? Do you remember when I banged on about this in the past? So the difference between kit and capability is that if you can go and buy kit, you break it, and then if you haven't got another one on the shelf, it ain't a capability. It's just a lump of kit. To have a capability, you've got to have all the defence lines of development met. So you've got to have a training regime. You've got to have the equipment itself and a funding line for it. You've got to have the personnel. You've got to have the infrastructure, the doctrine, the organisation, the information about how to actually use it, and the logistic chain. So in the British military, we called that tepid oil, but it's replicated elsewhere. But what I mean is that having a capability is more than just going and buying a drone or building a drone. You've got to have all the other bits and pieces there. Now, of course, that wider chain, and I mentioned earlier on with those Russian casualty figures, just think about the pressure that they're putting on Russia's logistic chain. If we throw our vision forward and think what might we realistically expect from drone innovation in 18 months' time, what impact will that have on all those other lines of development, on the training systems that need to be built for the individuals to fly these things, for the supply chains about how you're going to get this stuff, and are your supply chains, can they be over the border? They all got to be in Ukraine, for example. And therefore, what needs to start now? You've got to start putting money in line now to build the classrooms, to train the people, to build the factories, to make all that kind of stuff. So I'd just be keen on your thoughts here about what we think the state of the art might be in 18 months' time, and what needs to start happening now. For example, supply chains, training areas to fly these things, armoured fighting vehicle recognition, so that when you actually get to fly them, you pile into a very keenly sought-after air defence unit rather than just another armoured vehicle, for example. What about ethical training? Where's this drone warfare taking us? So I'd be really interested in your thoughts on what needs to start happening now in order to get us to some mythical point in sort of 18 months' time-ish when we think drones might be capable of doing X. Over to you, folks. I'd be really interested in your thoughts. Thanks, Adélie.
Thank you, Dom. Francis, any final thoughts?
Yes, I have a couple, if I may, Adélie. There's a long read in Reuters laying out in more detail the Biden administration's policy towards Ukraine and how its delays and anxieties around escalation impacted the war. On delays, it writes, by November 2024, just about half of the total dollar amount the US had promised in 2024 from American stockpiles had been delivered, and only about 30% of promised armoured vehicles had arrived by early December. Interestingly, it also cites Trump's special envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, as saying the following: there was a lot of talk about providing things, but they weren't in the right numbers. They weren't in the right time. The Biden administration had a fear of escalation. My belief is that great powers do not fear escalation. Very interesting. Remember that, folks. The piece then relays that even when the US secretly delivered missiles to Ukraine, the National Security Council's Russia Directorate and the Pentagon blocked their use in strikes inside Russia. We all remember that well, of course. They were worried, though, that Putin would target US troops abroad or step up Moscow's sabotage campaign in Europe. The Ukrainians, meanwhile, said they would accept deliveries in any shape, even subpar equipment, if it would speed things up. And the article even goes on to name names. Sitting behind the Resolute desk, the president called in General Charles Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Sullivan, Secretary Austin, Carpenter, and National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby. Biden had a simple question about lifting restrictions. Is this worth doing? The men were divided. Sullivan laid out the pros and cons, but took no position. Carmenter argued that Russia was unlikely to meaningfully react to the loosening of American weapons restrictions. Putin was already using sabotage and other unconventional attacks against European countries supporting Ukraine, and he said that the hybrid warfare campaign would continue regardless. Brown and Austin disagreed, claiming Russia could escalate in other ways, including targeting US military personnel overseas. Kirby agreed. Biden came to no immediate conclusion, telling his team he would have to think. But the US president soon decided against it again. So an interesting piece in Reuters. No surprises necessarily, but it just confirms the reports we've covered about the mentality of the administration, which was cautious and never truly wanted Kyiv to win militarily. But finally, final thought, keep an eye on Serbia. As one person wrote on X earlier, following, of course, reports of protests we were touching on last week in the country. It's difficult to describe what's currently happening in Serbia, and I don't think that such a thing has happened in Europe since the ending of the Cold War. The feeling is that every part of society is coming out to protest. Teachers, doctors, cab drivers, bus drivers, urbanites, villagers, and small towners. Even the poorest places in the country, which existentially depend on the regime, are out on the streets. People have also started boycotting the large supermarket chains for making extra profit, because this is truly a protest movement for justice in a political and social sense. It is hard, of course, to predict what's going to happen next. We will, on the podcast, continue to monitor it. Whatever happens in the Balkans will have significant repercussions for the battle lines between the West and Russia more broadly. So it is important. Watch this space.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all the Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine, the latest. Or sign up to Dispatches or Foreign Affairs newsletters, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us with a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.